Paul says, now this begins, question 6 begins in verse 13. It says, for I speak to you Gentiles, as much as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry, if by any means I may provoke to jealousy those who are my, and save some of them. Now, obviously Paul is changing the focus. Look, the letter's written to the whole church, but he's changing his focus here to the church, to the Gentiles, the Gentile Christians there at Rome. And of course we know that Paul began the letter in chapters 1 particularly on the sins of the Gentile world, and in chapter 2 the sins of the Jewish world. And then, in case anybody missed the point, he spent chapter 3 saying, in case you don't think you fit into one of those two categories, which obviously they did, the whole world is going under sin. Verses 9 and 10, chapter 3, verse 23 of chapter 3. And so, but Paul here is focusing his attention on a specific group within the church, and that is the Gentile Christians. And as we'll see, one thing that he's actually doing is he's actually teaching the Jewish Christians through what he's saying to the Gentile Christians. And we know how that can work. If we're speaking, say, to one group or one part of a group, we can also, by extension, teach another group while we're talking to these folks over here, right? All right, and so this is what's going on. And so Paul, gathers the end of the third line, top paragraph of notes. Paul gathers the undivided attention of the Gentile Christians to give them a specific message and warning. And he continues his assertion that their salvation may bring some Jews to saving faith. Now, Paul's reference to some of the Jews being provoked by or saved by provoking to jealousy could manifest itself in a couple of ways. For example, first, the blending of Jews and Gentiles together in the church might incite the unbelieving Jews to accuse their Jewish kinsmen, not unlike those Jews. Remember when Peter went and preached to Cornelius? And he came back, and the first thing that happened was the Jews said, you went in with uncircumcised men and you ate with them. And then what did Peter do? He explained what had happened. So when they accused him, then they had to listen. And in his explanation, he explained to them that this was God's plan all along. And when you get to the end of that, it says, and they glorified God that the gospel had been preached to the Gentiles. And so you have a potential similar situation here in the church at Rome. You have the church at Rome. Some Jewish Christians, some Gentile Christians. You have some Jews, synagogue, whatnot in the area, and they see Jews and Gentiles worshiping in the same building, and it just kind of flies all over them, right? What in the world is this? So then what does it do? It opens up a door whereby Paul or the Jewish Christians or anybody can talk to them about what's going on. And says, and this is the fourth line in that second paragraph after Acts 11:1. This would allow an explanation of the Old Testament texts that had been foretelling this all along. In other words, we've said this before, none of this should have been a surprise to anybody. It was in the Old Testament. God's promise to the Gentiles was in the Old Testament. They just couldn't see it because they were so, they had their blinders on. Hey, it's all about us, y'all. Nobody else, this is an exclusive club and nobody else is allowed. It's kind of like Alfalfa's He-Man Woman Haters Club. Remember that from the Little Rascals? I know I'm way past some of y'all. But they had the He-Man, there's no women allowed, no girls allowed. And so So, the Jews kind of had that mindset. Nobody else allowed. Well, then all of a sudden, when you see this collection of Jews and Gentiles, you get an opportunity. And so this provoking them to jealousy might allow them to be taught, also to incite them to go back to their synagogues and read the very verses that were given to them, right? In other words, well, he said this, and by the way, this has happened many, many times through the course of history. You've made me mad and you've told me something, and I'm going to go prove you wrong. And then I've opened up my Bible, and what ends up happening? I end up being converted because I found out that what I was told was right. It reminds me of an old man. I say an old man. He's not as old as he used to be. He was 85 when I first met him. But Henry Thurman. Henry Thurman was a member at the Mount Vernon Church when I worked out in Arizona. And Henry was raised in a denomination. And he was hard in that denomination. I'm talking about he was deep in it. Family and the whole thing. Well, he had an apartment over his garage. And as God's providence would have it, he rented that apartment to a young preacher in the local Church of Christ. And in the evenings, they would sit down and visit. He'd come down the steps and they'd sit and visit. And Henry'd want to talk to him about the Bible. And here's what the young man told him. He said, Henry, I'll be happy to talk to you about the Bible as long as you want. He says, but the minute you get mad, I'm going upstairs. And Henry said, invariably, we'd talk about the Bible and I'd get mad. He said, and true to his word, every time I got mad, that young man went upstairs. He said, made me even madder. He said, and I set out, I was going to prove that young man was wrong. And I studied my Bible, and I studied my Bible, and I studied my Bible. He said, and I found out that young man was right. And I obeyed the gospel. Now, to give you an idea of how hard Henry's family was in that denomination, he told his mother, Henry lived in Indiana at that time, but that's not relevant, but I'm just telling you, it was a long time ago. And Henry called his mother, or went to his mother's house and told her what he had done when he had obeyed the gospel. And his mother looked him in the eye and said, I'd have just as soon have carried you to the cemetery as to that Campbellite church. That's what his mother told him. I'd just as soon have carried you to the cemetery as to that Campbellite church. Henry was a faithful member of the church till the day he died. He was a pillar. He was a pillar of the church, a great man and a great encouragement to me. But that's the kind of thing we're talking about here. Being provoked to jealousy. In other words, being provoked to such a way that now, whereas I might have never been able to have been taught, now I'm able to be taught by whatever means it takes. Either Paul can teach them, or somebody can teach them, or they can go pull the scrolls and find out for themselves. So that's one way. All right. Then the second way could be, and I'm just speculating. All right. I mean, I'm just thinking, in what ways could Jews be provoked to jealousy? And now I thought about, maybe the Gentiles receiving of the spiritual gifts could have provoked them to jealousy. I mean, think about it, they were, as Paul described them in chapter 10, verse 19, they were not a people. I will provoke you to jealousy. That's also what chapter 10, 19 says. I will provoke you to jealousy by those who are no people. Now, can you imagine what a...
we're God's chosen people. How can they...
Yeah, we're God's chosen people. Now, how can this Gentile claim a relationship with God, and how in the world is he performing miracles? And I've never performed a miracle in my entire life. What's up with that? No, but again, that's no. And by the way, we would think, well, man, if I saw that, that'd convince me in a heartbeat, right? But it doesn't always work like that, does it? I mean, some people saw Lazarus raised from the dead, right? Did it cause them to believe? Nope. In fact, some of them decided they're just going to kill him, make him dead a second time, because Jesus was a threat to their exercise of authority over the people. We would think that when you see something like that, a person sees something like that, it would immediately change their mind, but it doesn't always work that way. But it could, and so I'm just speculating. It could be that. By the way, and let me tell you where I got this idea. I wasn't smart enough to come up with this on my own. Okay, I got it out of the Bible. Open your Bible to Galatians chapter 3. Look at Galatians chapter 3, and we're going to start in verse 1, okay? Now, Paul is writing to the Christians, the church at Galatia. But these Christians are Jewish Christians. And this verse shows it, or this text shows it, as well as all of chapter 4 and the allegory. Listen to what Paul says to these Jewish Christians. O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you that you should not obey the truth, before whose eyes Jesus Christ was clearly portrayed among you as crucified? Here's what I want to learn from you. Did you receive the Spirit by the works of the law or by the hearing of faith? In other words, he's pointing to their abilities that were given by the Holy Spirit, but he says, when did you get these? Did you get these while you were still following the law of Moses? Or did you get these when you embraced the faith of Christ? And to show you that that's exactly what he's talking about, go down to verse 5. Therefore, he who supplies the Spirit to you and works miracles among you, does he do it by the works of the law or by the hearing of faith? So now you see where I got that idea from. Paul was pointing to the very fact that these particular Jewish Christians in Galatia had performed miracles. And now they're in danger of going back under the law of Moses. And Paul's like, what in the world are y'all thinking? You've performed miracles. You've been given the miraculous gifts of the Holy Spirit. And when did you get these? Now, why would you go back to a system that never provided such for you? When you're in a system that does provide such for you. So that's where I got that idea about the miraculous. All right? Because Paul referred to it as, for lack of a better, as a sticking point with the Galatian Jews that were about to go back into Judaism. And if it would work in that sense, then it seems to me that it would also work in the sense of we're not performing miracles, the Gentiles are performing miracles. There has to be something to what's going on over here. All right? So that's where I got that. All right? And so to read it says, seeing those who are not a people, possessing and exercising such divine power, while they themselves, the children of God, continue powerless, might incite further investigation into this perceived inconsistency or discrepancy. Note I said perceived. They might think it's not right because of their blindness. It's a perceived misconception or discrepancy. All right. So now question 7. All right. This is verse 16. For if the first fruit is holy, the lump is also holy. And if the root is, so are the branches. Now, this verse contains two metaphors. All right? The first fruit and the lump, which may refer to dough. Okay, that's the idea of a lump. That's a lump of dough. And then there's also roots and branches. Okay? Now, this is not Paul saying the same thing using two different metaphors. In other words, this is not what would be termed in language as a Hebrew parallelism, saying the same thing twice but using two different pictures to say it. All right? With regard to the first, now, before I get into this, I'm just going to tell you, even reading this after I have written it down, it's really confusing. And what I mean by confusing is there is no consensus among really good conservative scholars as to the identity of each of these metaphors. But when you get to the end of the notes, you'll see they all do agree on one thing. In other words, here's the first metaphor, and here's four guys that believe that it's this, and two guys that believe that it's something else. And then you get to the next metaphor, and two of the guys are together, and two of them went with these two guys. I mean, it's just, to me, it's just mind-boggling. But the point is, we don't want to get caught up in the minutiae of the metaphors. We want to learn the lesson. Okay? And everybody's in agreement on the lesson. All right? So here I'm going to read it. Moses' Lord, who's one of ours, says the first fruits represent the first Jewish converts, while the lump represents the rest of Israel. So it teaches that if some of Israel can be saved, then all of Israel can be saved. Okay? And with this view, Lard, Cottrell, Whiteside, and Pollard all agree. Those are all our brethren. Whiteside, Lard, Cottrell, Pollard. Those are all our guys, and I cited where they showed that. But Brother David Roper believes the lump represents the patriarchs, and the first fruits are the Jews who believed and obeyed. Now, I want you to note something. You see right after Pollard, you see the citation there? You see where it says truth for today. Okay? You see right after Roper's at the bottom of the paragraph? Truth for today. Alright? Pollard wrote an exegetical commentary on this text, and Roper wrote a doctrinal commentary on this text. And they both work for the same publishing company, and they're both faithful Christians. And yet they're not in absolute agreement as to exactly who this metaphor applies to. All right? Now here we go where I was telling you. Here's 4 and 2, and then it's going to be 2 and 4. Look at the next paragraph. These men part ways on the meaning of the second metaphor. In this one, Pollard applies it to the patriarchs, and Lard and Whiteside apply it as a parallel to the first. I said I don't believe it's a parallel, but those three men believe it's a parallel. All right? And then Cottrell believes it's the patriarchs, but not only the patriarchs. Rather, he believes it includes all of faithful Israel throughout history. But here's the thing. The ultimate point is this. If some of Israel can be saved, then all of Israel can be saved. That's the point that he's making. If the patriarchs, if some can be saved beginning with the patriarchs, then all can be saved. Or if some of the Jews can be saved that were alive in the first century, and some of the, obviously the first church was exclusively Jewish. But one thing we have to remember is that even though we know that literally thousands and thousands of Jews obeyed the gospel on the day of Pentecost and in the days immediately following, it was still a very small portion of all the Jews. We think 3,000 obeyed on the day of Pentecost, and we're like, wow, 3,000! But there might have been 30,000 people in the temple court. You see? Yeah, 3,000 is a big number, but comparatively speaking, maybe not. And it was commonly reported that during these big feasts like Passover and Pentecost, there may have been as many as 500,000 to 1 million Jews in Jerusalem. So then 3,000 looks really small, right? Compared to 500,000. It's less than 1 in 100. And so, when we think about if the 3,000 can obey the gospel, then the 300,000 can obey the gospel. But it doesn't matter where you start. The ultimate point is, if they'll believe in Jesus, they can be saved. If they'll believe in Jesus, they can be saved. And we'll talk about these specific ideas as we move through the chapter. Okay? Now Paul's going to really hammer down on the Gentiles here in question 8, which is beginning in verse 17. It says, "And if some of the branches were broken off, and you being a wild olive tree were grafted in among them, and with them became a partaker of the root and fatness of the olive tree, do not boast against the branches. But if you do boast, remember that you do not support the root, but the root supports you." Now here's what's going on. There's a picture here. There's a picture here of the faithful people of God. And it begins with an olive tree. Okay? Now, the olive tree from the very beginning is 100% Jewish. Okay? Because Paul's speaking to the Gentiles. Remember, he's starting to focus his attention on the Gentiles. Here's a tree, an olive tree. And some of the branches on this olive tree were broken off, and some of the Gentiles were grafted in. Wild olive tree. By the way, does everybody I need to ask this. Does everybody understand the process of plant grafting? Are you familiar with it? Okay. This is still practiced in a lot of places today. You can take, for example, a peach tree and cut a branch off of it. Cut it clean, right up against the trunk. Then you can take that branch and go to another peach tree and make a cutting in that peach tree and make the branch fit into that cutting. And then they'll wrap it like with gauze and put some type of tree salve on it. And that branch that got cut off of this tree will end up growing inside of a completely different peach tree. And this is still practiced widely in agriculture, but I'm looking for a more specific word than agriculture. But horticulture. And it's not just trees. I mean, other plants and things it'll work. All right. So what Paul was saying is that there were branches broken off of this tree, which is a pure olive tree, and they've brought some branches off of a wild olive tree, and they've grafted them in to the original tree. And they took. All right, so what's the picture? The picture is, here's the Jewish people. They're God's people. All right? They're all a part of the tree. But then some of them got broke off. And the reason they got broke off is because they refused to believe in Jesus. So when these Jews refused to believe in Jesus, God broke them out. Then the gospel gets preached to the Gentiles, and the Gentiles that believe in Jesus are grafted in. So now you've got everybody still a part of the one tree. Some of the branches are the originals, and some of the branches are grafted in off of a wild tree. So now you have Jews and Gentiles in the one tree. Okay? Are we all on board here? All right, so now let's go to page 4. I'm not going to read these notes, okay? I'm just going to continue to explain the picture. Paul issues a warning to these Gentiles who've been grafted in. Don't think too highly of yourself. In order for you to get here, somebody had to do it. You know, somebody had to do something, right? Somebody had to get you from here to here. And so now you're a part of the same tree. You're part of the same tree. All right? But don't boast. Don't boast. Don't say anything about the branches that were broke off. That ain't got nothing to do with you. Okay? Now, the picture is, and we can see this in real life, sometimes people get placed in positions in life that really doesn't have anything to do with them or their ability or what they've accomplished. Now, look, I'm going to assume that just about every one of them housewife shows is one of them. I've never seen one. You know, the Real Housewives of New Jersey or Bug Tussle, or wherever there's Scuffle Grit, the Real Wives, right? So you got all these women, right? And they're all catty, right? They all, Lexi, I know you watch all these shows. I'm just kidding. All right, so, but y'all know what I'm talking about, right? You got a bunch of women here who ain't never done nothing in their life but marry well. Right? All they've done is marry well. But all of a sudden they think they're better than everybody else because their husband makes a lot of money. Right? By the way, I know people that this has happened to. I know people, and we probably all do. We probably all know somebody who married very well, and all of a sudden she got better than everybody else. Right? That's what Paul's warning against here. In other words, you're a part of this tree, yes. But you don't have any right to boast against anybody. Because this tree is not about you. You're not supporting the tree. You're not supporting the root. The root is supporting you. So don't get everything backwards about who's most important in this tree. Now, God, and I did put this in your notes at the beginning of the third paragraph. In Deuteronomy chapter 8, God through Moses was telling the children of Israel all of the good things that was fixing to happen to them in the promised land. You're going to live in houses that you didn't build. You're going to eat fruit out of orchards you didn't plant. You're going to eat grapes off vines that you didn't tend. You're going to drink fresh water out of wells that you didn't dig. And what's going to happen? And there's a warning that's issued. It says, and when you have eaten and are full, you better not forget how you got there. You didn't build that house. You didn't plant that orchard. You didn't tend those vines. You didn't dig that well. You better not think too highly of yourself just because all of a sudden you've been placed in a really great place to live. It says, do not forget the Lord. For it is He who gives you power to get wealth. You see? A warning. Don't think too highly of yourself. When what you've been given has been given to you by God, and it's not because you're so great that you got it. That's the warning. So then look, question 9. You will say then, branches were broken off that I might be grafted in. Well said. Because of unbelief they were broken off. And you stand by faith. Do not be haughty or high-minded, but fear. For if God did not spare the natural branches, He may not spare you either. In other words, if you decide you're going to get all high-minded about your place in the tree, you better remember something. The same God that broke them off, He'll break you off. If you go into unbelief, and by the way, unbelief doesn't mean you have to quit believing in God. Unbelief means you can believe that you deserve to be in the tree. That you're somehow better than somebody else because you're in the tree. That's the same thing as unbelief, because that's not what God wants us to believe. And Paul says, you better watch out. The same God that broke those branches off, break you off. And then he goes on, and Lord willing, we'll pick this up next week. He says, and not only that, God can take the branches that he broke off and do what? Graft them back in. By the way, there's some great lessons in that we'll get into. All right, so we'll pick up in 10. I'm trying to go a little faster. I want to get done with chapter 11 before that little summer break, because chapter 11 ends the theological section of this book, and chapter 12 begins a practical section. In other words, we can stop at chapter 11 and not come back for 7 or 8 weeks and start in chapter 12. And it's not like you've missed anything, because the whole tenor of the book changes. It's like a whole new, not just a whole new chapter, it's a whole new section. So we won't have to go back and refresh ourselves on chapter 11 in order to start a study of chapter 12. And so that's why I'm kind of trying to get moving along here, and want to get done by the end of May.